All right, let's go. Number 10. The flint the lobster dug up. A lobster did the digging. The seabed off Bouldnor on the northern shore of the Isle of Wight is black peat, and every animal living down there tunnels into it. Each tunnel leaves a small mound of ejected material at its mouth. Divers on that shelf, roughly 250 meters out and 11 meters down, started noticing struck flint sitting in those mounds towards the end of the 1990s. Human hands had shaped the stone. A crustacean had brought it up. Charts had marked a drowned forest at Bouldnor since the 1980s, and local fishermen had been hauling worked stone off the same ground for 2 decades before that. What nobody had shown was that people lived in it. Gary Momber and the Maritime Archaeology Trust have gone back almost every year since. No other stratified prehistoric occupation site has ever been located in the waters around Britain, which makes this eroding cliff the only one we have. Dates from the site cluster between 6,240 and 6,000 BC. 8,000 years ago, the Solent was a valley with a river in it, not a strait, and the Isle of Wight was attached to the mainland. Wood is what the peat returned, and the worked timber pulled out of that one cliff more than doubled the total we had for the entire British Middle Stone Age. A single plank carried the argument, 94 centimeters by 41, and split along the growth rings rather than cleft into quarters, which is how a board is produced instead of a wedge. The oak it came from was over 750 millimeters in diameter. Nobody expected that method in Britain before the Neolithic, and the nearest comparison is a monument like Haddenham, 2,500 years further on. The 2019 season produced something better. About 60 trimmed and split timbers laid in as many as 3 stacked layers, making a solid surface just under 2 meters wide across ground that had been soft. Charcoal came up beside them, and so did burnt flint and 10 centimeters of twisted plant fiber, a millimeter or 2 thick, spun from nettle or clematis or blackberry or honeysuckle. No older piece of string is known from anywhere in the country. Momber thinks a log boat was under construction. There is no boat. Another reading of the same timbers proposes a wooden building that fell in, and neither option leaves the carpentry where we had it. The platform now sits in cold storage at the National Oceanography Center in Southampton, but here is where Bouldnor turned into a fight. Sedimentary DNA from a sealed horizon went into Science in 2015, published by Oliver Smith with Robin Alibi, and among the sequences was einkorn wheat, a domesticated cereal 20 centuries ahead of farming's arrival in Britain. By November, a team at the Max Planck Institute had replied in Life, pointing out that the wheat reeds showed none of the chemical decay real ancient DNA carries, and that modern contamination was the likelier answer. The Bouldnor side responded with a preprint arguing from thermal age. No journal has ever reviewed it. Nothing since has moved the question either way. Meanwhile, the cliff is going. Survey work records lateral retreat reaching 4 meters over a decade, and each year the face gives up another 10 to 50 centimeters of intact prehistoric ground surface. 38 more flints came off it in November 2020, one of them a complete tranchet axe. Bouldnor Cliff holds no heritage designation whatsoever, and the protection over it covers marine wildlife rather than the settlement underneath. The disturbing part is what that does to the method. Scour uncovers the timbers, and Scour removes them, which turns every new find into an estimate of the material already destroyed. No archaeologist is really excavating Bouldnor. The tide is, and the divers are working out what it took last winter. Number 9. Drop 4. 5. They found it by rebuilding the lake bottom inside a computer. Lake Huron sat far lower through the Lake Stanley phase, between about 11,000, 308,400 years ago. The drop ran to 70 or even 100 meters, exposing a ridge of limestone that reaches from Michigan across to Ontario. Call it 200 kilometers end to end and 15 at its widest. Cold shrub tundra covered it, bogs in the hollows. 15 to 50 meters of fresh water covers it now. John O'Shea and Guy Meadows at the University of Michigan rebuilt that dry corridor as a model, worked out where moving animals would be funneled, and put sonar on those places. Their first report of stone lines and rings appeared in 2009 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The structure that ended the argument came out in the same journal 5 years later. The site lies 56 kilometers southeast of Alpena in 37 meters of water, on a neck of the ridge under 2 kilometers wide. 2 parallel stone lines run across limestone bedrock for 30 meters, 8 meters apart, with 3 round hunting blinds built into the lines. More lines flank it to the west, where a natural cobble pavement blocks the exit, so an animal entering has nowhere to go. Roughly 100 meters by 28 is the size of the trap. 11 chipped stone flakes came off the lane after divers excavated it by hand. The southern opening gave up 7, and 2 blinds gave up 2 each. Local traverse formation chert accounts for 8 of them. Another 17 test units along the same feature were sterile, and the sterile units carry the argument, because the debris clusters exactly where a hunter would have knelt and waited, and appears nowhere else. Spruce and tamarack still stand rooted in the sediment, drowned upright unmoved for 90 centuries. Divers who work there call it a haunting place to swim. A ring of small stones held charcoal, dated to about 9,020 years ago. Nothing violent happened when the ridge went under. Fine sediment stones left where hands set them almost no burial by later deposits. Without that combination, none of it would be legible to us. What makes the architecture remarkable is that it preserves a form of social organization. Simple V-shaped blinds sit upslope opening to the southeast, matched to autumn movement and small enough for one family to run. The big lane points the opposite way at animals heading northwest in spring, and no single household could operate it. Someone drives, someone waits, someone seals the far end. What survives is the plan for a season and a crowd. A different locality on the ridge, in 32 meters of water, yielded 2 obsidian flakes from deposits dated between 9,000 and 8,800 years ago. 3 separate laboratories traced the glass to the wagon tire flow in central Oregon, more than 4,000 kilometers west. No confirmed Western obsidian in the continental United States is older, and none has been found further east. That is an extraordinary distance for a chip of volcanic glass in the 9th millennium BC. Ashley Lemke later put a virtual reconstruction of the corridor in front of Alaska native caribou hunters. They studied the lane and the blinds and described how it would be worked. And then there is the absence. No caribou bone has ever come off the Alpena-Amberley Ridge. No faunal material of any description has come off it. The animals live only in an agent-based simulation that Robert Reynolds runs at Wayne State University, where digital herds learn the ground over thousands of migrations and settle on a few crossings. The model has paid for itself. It flagged a crossing. Nobody had dived. The team went out to check, and a second drive lane was sitting there. Over 60 stone constructions have now been mapped along the ridge. Every stone is measured. Every animal is modeled. We are holding the machinery with nothing that ever ran through it. Number 8. Kuahuqiao. 2 heritage officers, Shi Jianian and Ni Bingjiang, walked the cutting face of a brick and tile quarry on the 1st of June, 1990. The Chengxiang work sat on the edge of Xiang Lake south of Hangzhou and had been mining a low rise for clay for years. Sherds of black pottery lay in the section along with animal bone deer antler and pieces of worked wood that had not yet hardened. Kilns had already consumed most of the site. A dark band of occupation, over a meter thick and about 30 meters long, was all that survived in the quarry wall. Occupation starts about 8,000 years ago, on the southern bank of the Qiantang, upstream from Hangzhou Bay. Excavation has produced over 1,000 grains of rice and phytoliths in quantity. What matters is the spikelet bases, and roughly 58% of them shatter in the wild manner. So the crop was being selected by people without having become domesticated. Rice caught in the middle of the change. Yongcheng Zong and colleagues put the environmental sequence into Nature in 2007, and their conclusion went further than sediment usually allows. Spikes of microcharcoal, alder swamp scrub collapsing, wet grassland taking over with the algal and fungal spores, and shifting diatoms that go with it. Read as one record that is a community burning back the marsh, keeping the clearing open. and admitting slightly brackish water behind constructed banks. The earliest managed rice field we know of. We should be exact about what that rests on. Nobody has excavated a bund, a ditch, or a field there. The paddy comes out of microfossils. The rest of the evidence is solid, and a surprising amount of it is soft. Wheel finished and painted pottery, some tempered with rice husk. 20 pits for storing acorns inside a single 300 square meter exposure. A raised earthen platform built up through 19 distinct layers to about 1.5 meters. Peach stones falling into two-size groups, which is what happens once somebody starts keeping the better trees. Domestic pig, established through dental calculus, trapped starch and whipworm eggs, sitting in an otherwise largely wild fauna. Slaughter. Ages drop across the sequence, from 4.5 years down to under 3, which is what management looks like in the bones. And a wooden bow carrying 3 coats of natural lacquer, among the earliest lacquer work we have from anywhere on the planet. November 2002 produced the canoe. What survives runs 5.5 meters, 52 centimeters at its broadest, with a shell 2 to 3 centimeters thick. A split-masoned pine trunk was hollowed by burning it in controlled patches. Wet clay masking whatever had to be spared, and the char then dressed out with stone adzes. Somebody had repaired it, gluing a wooden patch over a hole with lacquer. Paddles adze handles, whetstones matting, and a row of driven stakes lay around it. Nobody lost this boat. Somebody was building it. The problem arrives above the house floors. Freshwater diatoms give way to salt-tolerant and marine species. Estuarine foraminifera turn up, and barnacles fix themselves to the stone and the pots. From about 7,500 years ago, sea level was climbing rapidly again, and whatever earthwork stood between the village and the water stopped being sufficient. The speed of the ending is disputed. Zong's group reads a slow estuarine intrusion that spoiled the ground long before it covered it. Others propose catastrophic overbank flooding out of the Chiantang tidal bore, which is still the largest in the world. The slow version is the more unsettling, because a flood is an accident, and a rising water table is a sentence. Nobody has settled it. The outcome does not depend on the answer. A layer of gray marine clay up to 1 meter deep covers the houses, the rice, and the boat, and nothing ever stripped it off again. Those cultural layers lie beneath today's mean sea level. Nobody raised the canoe either. It sits at the spot where it was shaped, sealed in a glass chamber 6.5 meters under the surface of Xiang Lake, with a museum built above the hole. People stand on the floor and look down at it. Without the clay that finished the village, there would be nothing to look at. Number 7. Tybrind Vig. Sport divers out of Fredericia began pulling wood off the bottom of a shallow bay on Finn's west coast in 1975. There was a great deal of it, and washed flint lay among it. Hans Dahl recognized what the material meant and carried it to Soren Andersen at Aarhus University a year later. Hand excavation underwater began in 1978 and ran every summer for 10 years. 2 to 3 meters of water covers the site, about 250 meters out from the modern beach, and its preservative is gitja, a waterlogged organic mud 3 meters deep in places with no oxygen anywhere in it. By Andersen's reckoning, about 9/10 of the recovered equipment was made from materials other than flint. That reverses the usual Stone Age picture. Normally, the stone is the survivor and everything else has decayed. Very few places let us look at the perishable half of the Mesolithic. These were Ertubola people using the bay through the 6th and 5th millennia. C. Lime dugouts lay on the bottom, 3 intact enough to publish. The best of them 9.5 meters long, with walls about 2 centimeters thick. 2 carried a slab of clay, roughly 60 by 35 centimeters, set on the floor 1/3 of a meter in from the stern. Andersen's proposal is a portable hearth rather than a fixed fireplace, something carried aboard and put down. Fire on the water inside a shell, no thicker than a finger. Night fishing for eels is the best guess. 4 of the 14 ash paddles are ornamented. The patterns cut in shallow relief and filled with a brown, iron-rich material that is probably ochre. Circles, ovals, dots, and lines. Their range is about 4,800 to 4,200 BCE. and no decorated wood of any earlier date exists from the Danish Mesolithic. A carved paddle carries meaning, and the meaning is exactly what we cannot recover. The textiles are the strangest survival. 14 scraps, each one looped by needle from a single spun willow bast thread in a stitch somewhere between coarse knitting and a string bag. 33 cords were twisted, and 6 ropes. Fish weirs left 250 sharpened hazel rods. There are 67 leister prongs, a wickerwork trap, 20 elm bows, and hooks cut from red deer bone with a plant fiber line still knotted to one of them. Charred crusts inside pointed-based pots turned out on analysis to be cod soup, and 658 pine marten bones came up, mostly as articulated skeletons with skinning marks around the skulls. A study published in 2025 rereads those martens as deliberate deposition rather than the residue of a fur trade. What makes the assemblage extraordinary is how ordinary it is. Nothing here is a tomb or a shrine. This is a working beach with the hulls and the traps and the pelts lying where somebody set them down. One of the dugouts had been weighted with a large stone, which is usually read as ballast rather than a burial. A grave lay 7 to 9 centimeters beneath the lagoon floor. A girl of 14 to 16, roughly 145 centimeters tall, on her back with her head pointing north and her left palm across the pelvis. An infant no older than 3 months lay over her chest, tucked in under her right arm, its face turned to hers. Between 5,620 and 5,390 BC is the date. Isotopes from her bone say her diet came almost entirely out of the sea. Others are down there with her. Amateur divers reported bone from the outer edge of the site in 2004, and the excavation that followed uncovered 2 adults lying side by side, elbows touching. 5 individuals are known from that bay so far. It may be a cemetery. Nothing was placed with her. 7,500 years of moving water explains that, and also conceals it. Her grave is about 125 centimeters long. She was about 145. The published reading is brutal. In its simplicity, the body was pressed down into a hole that had been cut too short. Every version of that is still a person, hurried or grieving, managing as well as they could with an antler spade and a dead child. 3 meters of water sit over her. A diver could go down, look at her, and be back ashore before lunch. Number 6. La Marmotta. 5 Neolithic canoes went into print together in 2024. The biggest is a single oak trunk, 10 meters and 43 centimeters of it, with timbers dated between 5,620 and 5,085 BC. All 5 came off the bed of a volcanic crater lake to the northwest of Rome. Bracciano occupies a collapsed caldera, and a pipeline crew working across the bottom hit timber in the spring of 1989. Some 300 meters out from the shore, beneath about 8 meters of water, and meters of silt below that. What they had struck was a village. Maria Antonietta Fugazzola del Pino directed systematic underwater excavation there from 1992 until 2006. The site is La Marmotta, occupied between roughly 5,700 and 5,150 BC, one of the earliest permanently settled wetland villages in southern Europe. Silt held on to all of it. Around 3,400 oak piles were driven into the lake bed, of which 2,044 have been read for tree rings, producing an absolutely dated 248-year sequence that runs from 5,538 to 5,290 BC and fixes the life of the village to the calendar year. 13 or 14 houses stood there rectangular, 6 meters wide and 8 to 10 long, partitioned inside each with a hearth at the center. 52 wooden sickles survive with their flint teeth still mounted, held by an adhesive of pine resin charcoal and beeswax. There are 78 loom weights. There are 8 spindles, one still carrying its thread. There are 34 weaving swords, 43 pieces of coiled basketry, and 4 fragments of plant fiber cloth. Cereals and pulses account for about 65% of the identified plant material. Immer, bread, wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. Opium poppy shows up as well, the earliest anywhere in the Mediterranean. Sheep and goat outnumber everything in the bone assemblage. Under one floor, laid down with ochre and burnt seed, somebody had buried a small green steatite woman 4.8 centimeters long, and Gravettian in style. And specialists still disagree about whether it is a genuine Paleolithic heirloom or a much later imitation. There is also obsidian, and it comes from Lipari and from Palmarola. Islands, both of them. These farmers were sailors, whatever else they were, and nothing showed what they sailed in until 2024. 5 hulls, 4 timbers, oak, alder, poplar, and beech, each picked for its properties. 4 trapezoidal cross pieces were carved out of the oak trunk itself and left standing proud of the floor. 3 pierced T-shaped fittings are mounted in the wall, 1 drilled twice, 1 3 times, 1 4. The excavators stay careful at this point, and so should we. Rope through those fittings could have carried a sail or an outrigger or a second hull lashed on to make a double boat. Nobody has found a sail. What exists is a fitting capable of holding one. The reason this matters is a problem of speed. Farming crossed the Mediterranean within a few centuries, traveling the coasts quicker than walking pace. And that speed always implied craft we had never found. 5 of them now lie on a table in Rome. Radomir Tichy's team built a copy of the 10-meter hull in 1998, about a meter shorter because of rot in the tree, and paddled it 762 kilometers by stages from Sicily to Lisbon. 2.5 tons of timber, 4 kilometers an hour, open sea. Every harbor and terrace along that route stands on a coast these people were the first to reach. How the village ended is unresolved. Pots with food still inside them. Tools and the boats were abandoned in place, which looks like a departure rather than a decline. The final occupation layer contains burning. A review published in 2025 states outright that nobody knows whether fire drove the people out was lit as they went or came through afterwards. Everyone agrees the lake came up over the shore and never went back. About a quarter of the village has been excavated. What remains beneath the lake is in better condition than what has been brought up. Some of the recovered timber now stands in Rome in tanks of ordinary tap water at room temperature, and sequencing of those tanks has identified erosion bacteria and soft rot fungi consuming it. There is something disturbing in that arithmetic. 7,000 years in the lake, 30 in our care. Number 5. The cave that painted the coastline. Henri Cosquer was working as a professional diver in 1985 when he came across an opening in the rock 37 meters down at the base of Cap Morgiou outside Marseille. Other divers knew the opening existed, and none had gone into it. Cosquer pushed a little deeper each season alone, at first laying line behind him along a black flooded passage. That passage measures 116 meters. A diver covers all of it before surfacing, and the whole route from the sea to the beach inside comes to about 174 meters. Past the siphon, the cave widens into chambers with a beach and a lake of their own. The decorated area contained within a rough circle 60 meters wide. Cosquer reached the far chamber on the 9th of July, 1991, with Jan Goguen Pascale Auriol and his niece Lyonesse, and turned a lamp onto the wall. A hand. 3 divers entered the same passage on the 1st of September that year and never surfaced. They had no interest in paintings and no knowledge that a cave existed beyond the siphon. Cosquer notified the French authorities a few days after the recovery of the bodies. Jean Courtin and Jean Klotz dived it that same month, took charcoal samples, and located engravings under a seal of calcite. A number of specialists declined to believe any of it before the radiocarbon results arrived. The catalog has kept expanding. There are 65 hand stencils, 21 in red and 44 in black. A count published in 2005 gave 177 animals in 11 species, and the figure has since gone past 230 in about 12. Horse ibex bison, aurochs, red deer, chamois, a feline megaloceros, and a saiga antelope that hardly appears in French cave art at all. Add 216 geometric signs and long stretches of finger fluting. One figure is a man with a seal's head, and another is a man who seems to have been killed. Nothing else painted in the Ice Age holds what comes next. 9 seals, 3 great auks, fish, and marks that might be jellyfish. 2 phases split the cave. Helene Veladis and colleagues published 41 radiocarbon determinations in 2017. 17 sampled straight from the images, and they spread from roughly 33,000 to 20,000 years ago. Hands belong to the earlier phase, most animals to the later. Painted left alone for something like 10 millennia, then rediscovered and painted again by people who remembered nothing about their predecessors. But here is where the seals and the auks change everything. Sea level at the time of those paintings was 110 to 130 meters below today's, and the shore stood 6 to 10 kilometers further out. This was not a cave by the sea. It was a cave in a hillside overlooking a broad coastal plain. So the seals and the auks were never brought in from anywhere exotic. They lived at the bottom of the slope. It is the one look we get at the drowned coast of Ice Age Europe, made by people who could stand in the entrance and study it. That is the haunting part. Everything they chose to draw is now submerged. So is most of the drawing. Around 3/4 of the cave system lies underwater. And in the flooded sections, the sea, the algae, and the mollusks have scoured the rock until nothing painted or engraved remains on it, which is why the original number of animal figures is estimated at somewhere between 4 and 800. There are 230. The rest are unrecoverable, and we will never learn what they showed. It has not stopped. And that is the frightening part. Water inside the cave came up about 12 centimeters in 2011, and damaged art that had survived 20,000 years. Luc Van Rel, who runs the diving team, called the effect on his people a psychological blow. A few millimeters a year is the rate of climb, and marine microplastics have now been detected in the chambers. Recording has replaced rescue as the strategy. Photogrammetry topographic survey, seismic monitoring, and a duplicate. The duplicate cost 23 million euros. Opened in Marseille during June 2022. And reproduces every painting, along with about 90% of the engraving. A steel grille has closed the real entrance since 2015. Cosquer is not going to be saved. The intention is to finish photographing the cave before the sea finishes it, and then to let the public visit the photograph. Number 4. The town with no name. A town lies in 1 to 4 meters of clear water off a beach in the southeast of Laconia, facing the island of Elafonisos. This is not tumbled masonry, streets, courtyards, doorways opening into rooms, the rooms grouped into blocks, and graves at the margins. Remains were noted there by a Greek geologist in 1904 and forgotten. Proper identification came in 1967 from Nicholas Fleming, who was surveying ancient sea levels. And a Cambridge team arrived the next summer to map it over 6 weeks with hand tapes, a fixed grid, and a camera slung from a balloon. Their plan covered about 300 meters by 100 and recorded at least 15 building complexes, 5 streets, a pair of chamber tombs, and 37 cist graves. 60 more graves are cut into the rock on the shore behind. Then it sat for 40 years. Elias Spondylis of the Greek Ephrate of underwater antiquities came back with John Henderson of Nottingham and a set of instruments in 2009. A robotic total station fixed most survey points to under 3.5 centimeters. Sector scanning sonar covered 31,000 square meters of seabed. Divers swimming a stereo camera rig ran 47 dives in 10 days and captured over 135,000 paired images. 9,000 square meters of unrecorded buildings appeared in the first season. Ceramics moved the clock. Final Neolithic sherds pulled the earliest occupation back to roughly 3,500 BC, 7 centuries before the date the town had carried. That is the headline, and it holds up. But it comes with one qualification. Final Neolithic pottery makes up 3% of the assemblage, and early Bronze Age makes up 40%. This is not a Neolithic village on the seabed, and it is not a Mycenaean city. It is an early Bronze Age port. The pots show what the port was for. Storage jars marked with rope and finger impressions. Minoan-style wares, a broken Vafio cup, a clay strainer, conical cups of early Minoan type. It shares a material culture with Castri over on Kythera, which stands on the sea route around the southern Peloponnese. Loom weights point to textile production. In the literature, it is the safest anchorage on that coast, a gateway holding the door between the Aegean and everything beyond. Pavlopetri did not simply drown. Beach rock, which is old shoreline cemented into stone, has been radiocarbon dated, and it registers the town being dropped by earthquakes in stages. One after about AD 525, another after about AD 1120, and a third before roughly AD 1500. Measured tectonic downlift accounts for about 1.6 meters, with 4 to 5 meters more, from sea level rise across 5,000 years. By AD 500, most of the buildings already had a meter of water on them. Nobody lived there for any of that. The town ends in the post-palatial collapse between 1180 and 1100 BC, which means the order of events runs backwards from everything we expect. And that is the unsettling part of Pavlopetri. The people left. The ground then lowered an empty town into the sea over the following 2 millennia, with nobody present to notice. Which is also why the plan can be read: ruins on land suffer, because people go on living on them. Good stone gets taken for the next wall. Roman foundations settle onto Bronze Age. Once a road covers the lot, and the layout is the first thing the next builders destroy. This place was abandoned once lowered into the water and left alone. Spondylus describes it as a frozen moment. Nowhere else can a swimmer follow a Bronze Age street to its end and turn into somebody's yard. Older submerged settlements exist, and one is still ahead in the countdown. What Pavlopetri holds that they do not is a layout readable in a single afternoon. The World Monuments Watch listed it in 2016 because boats anchor over it. And an anchor landing on a 5,000-year-old wall does an earthquake's work instantly. Monitoring since 2008 has found it degrading faster than predicted. Rotting seagrass and moving sand. Tourist boats pilfering tankers at anchor offshore. A power station, a pipeline proposal. 3 earthquakes never erased that ground plan. A busy August might. The one thing the town lacks is a name. What its builders called it is not known. Pavlopetri is a modern label taken from an islet close by. And the harbor was a ruin underwater before anyone in that region wrote a word that has reached us. We have the streets, the doorways, the graves, and the cups. Their word for home went down with them. Number 3. The kingdom that was never there. The Isles of Scilly came with a standard explanation for centuries, and it was a story. Somewhere west of Land's End lay a country containing 140 parish churches. A single night of sea removed all of it, and one rider on a fast horse stayed ahead of the water. Lyonesse is the country's name. The date usually attached to the flood is 1099. Hardly any of it holds up. The name Lyonesse comes out of French Arthurian romance, where it descends from a Latin term for Lothian in Scotland, and English writers moved it to Cornwall centuries later. Those 140 churches arrived by way of Robert Hunt, a folklorist publishing in 1865 and citing a 15th century antiquarian. The objections are printed in Hunt's own pages, where an earlier commentator has already reduced the count from 140 to 40, and another calls the horseman an idle tale. As for 1099, it comes from an Anglo-Saxon chronicle line about a Martinmas sea flood that mentions neither Cornwall nor Scilly, except that the islands did drown, and the measured version is stranger than the legend. The Cornwall Archaeological Unit ran the Lyonesse project across the archipelago in 2009 and 2010. Pete survey pollen. Diatoms for Aminifera. 78 radiocarbon dates and 15 luminescence ages. Analysis was led by Dan Charman at Exeter, and the synthesis reached Science Advances in 2020. 12,000 years ago, there was one island out there, 17 kilometers by 8.5, some 80 square kilometers of ground. Today, the total is roughly 16. Prehistory consumed the difference, and in the 4 millennia after 8,000 years ago, roughly 36% of the land still standing went under. Relative sea level climbed roughly 2.8 millimeters annually from 7,000 years ago to 4,500. On a flat archipelago, that trivial figure does terrible work. Between 5 and 4,000 years ago, the water advanced sideways at 1 to 3 meters a year, and a 70-year life covered the loss of over 700,000 square meters. None of that is invisible. It happens across a working life rather than a night. It shows up at the far end of a field and on the beach where a family had always drawn its boat up. What makes this remarkable is the response. They stayed. Bronze Age activity intensifies while the land is breaking apart. And the islands now hold over 600 recorded monuments from that period. Among them, 92 entrance graves and 384 cairns. Shipman Head, down on Briar, accounts for 134 cairns by itself. Out on Sampson Flats, a field system walks off the beach and continues below the low water mark. Hilltops that were visibly turning into islands went on receiving the dead, which is an extraordinary practice to maintain, and stubbornness is not the whole of the reason. Sinking a shallow archipelago subtracts land and manufactures margin. By 4,000 years ago, the ground between the tides was nearly half the land area again. That ground is shellfish fish, traps, and sheltered water. The sea took their fields and restocked their larder in one movement. Nornur makes the point better than any figure does. It is an uninhabited rock in the Eastern Isles, crossed on foot in under a minute, carrying no fewer than 11 rounded rubble buildings in a complex 56 meters long. Raised in the early 2nd millennium BC and rebuilt across the 2,000 years that followed, one became a shrine under Roman rule. People crossed open water to a shrinking islet and left 300 brooches, 84 coins, and clay, goddess figurines in it. Can a story carry 4,000 years? Patrick Nunn and a co-author argued in 2024 that the Lyonesse tradition plausibly descends from real land loss more than 4 millennia back. A 2025 reply holds that the case fails and cautions against treating a tale as ancient merely because the geology is. In the papers that measured the flooding, Lyonesse never comes up. So the story has the sea wrong, the date wrong, and the churches wrong. The island it gets right, and the island is the part we can measure. There was one, and it went under. On Parr Beach on St. Martin's, a line of set stones emerges from the sand at low tide and runs down the shore. It is a field wall. You can walk it on ground that stopped being land while the people who cleared it were still working it. Number 2. The burial pond under the Gulf. A recreational diver went looking for fossil shark teeth in June 2016. A quarter of a mile out from Manasota Key on Florida's Gulf Coast in 21 feet of water. What he lifted was half a human jaw with a worn molar still in its socket. He marked the position and telephoned the state. Everything after that happened because he made the call. Ryan Duggins, the state underwater archaeologist, ran the investigation for Florida's Bureau of Archaeological Research, and in February 2018, the Secretary of State announced what lay on that seabed. No wreck, no bone washed in by weather, 3/4 of an acre of undisturbed peat, with human burials lying where they were placed and carved wooden stakes fire-hardened, driven around the bodies into what had been the floor of a pond. The Gulf of Mexico was about 9 meters lower 7,000 years ago, and Florida's coast ran far west of its present line. At the last glacial maximum, the peninsula was close to double its modern area. So this was neither an underwater site nor a coastal one. It was fresh water, roughly 2.7 meters above the sea of that period about 7 kilometers in from the beach, and the people who used it were putting their dead into the water on purpose. Florida has plenty of documentation for the practice, and the chemistry is why it works. Peat contains no oxygen. Bone lasts in it. So does wood, and so does textile. Glenn Doran excavated a pond of similar age at Wendover, near Titusville, in the mid-1980s, and it yielded 168 individuals, 91 of them with brain tissue still inside the skull, and 87 pieces of hand-woven plant fiber fabric, which rank among the oldest textiles we have anywhere in the Americas. Those bodies had been staked down onto the pond floor as well. At Little Salt Spring to the south, a sharpened stake turned up, driven between the shell plates of an extinct giant tortoise, and the wood is around 12,000 years old. All of those places are dry land. Manasota Key is not. The truly unsettling part is how little defense a drowned cemetery has. Peat that did not erode is remarkable by itself. Instead, the sea arrived, buried the pond entire beneath sand, and kept it sealed for 70 centuries. Oysters that settled while the water was coming in have been sectioned and red like tree rings. And their oxygen chemistry traces the change from fresh to estuarine to conditions saltier than the open Gulf. Leaves, twigs, branches, and freshwater snails are still in the peat. It is a photograph of the afternoon the pond stopped being a pond. The burials lie in clusters within that layer, ringed by the stakes. Each one sharpened and fire-hardened before it went in. Somebody stood in shallow water and fastened a person to the bed of a pond, so the body would stay precisely where it had been laid. The fastening still holds 7,000 years on. Under 30 feet of ocean, nobody there could have pictured. According to Florida's assessment, burial grounds of this kind are recorded from just 2 other coastlines, in Israel and in Denmark. That makes 3 on Earth. And it is a disturbing figure once you weigh it against the amount of inhabited shoreline the sea has swallowed. The state's response was unlike anything else in this countdown. Nothing intrusive was attempted: magnetometry, sub-bottom profiling, and side-scan sonar, with the ground holding human remains left alone. The Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee were consulted throughout. Neither images of the remains nor DNA testing were permitted at their request. Their position was that as little as possible should be moved, and that anything belonging to a body return to where it was found. Buoys marked the perimeter in July 2018. Interference with an unmarked human burial is a third-degree felony under Florida law, and patrol boats work that water. It is the entire defense of a 7,000-year-old cemetery under a busy diving coast. Some floats one statute, and the odds that whoever next picks up a bone reaches for a phone. Hurricane Irma tore through the protective measures in 2017 and shifted both stakes and remains. Strangers argue about every other site in this countdown. This one has family. The people who set those stakes around their dead have living descendants. Those descendants were asked what ought to happen, and the answer was that their ancestors be left where they were put. Number 1. The coast that built a wall. On the coast of what is now northern Israel, 9,000 years ago, the Mediterranean was rising at 4 to 7 millimeters a year. Convert that into a lifetime. 30 years of adulthood meant watching the water rise 12 to 21 centimeters. A century could take 70. Because the shelf slopes so gently there, a few centimeters upward, take a great deal of beach. They did not leave. They built. Ehud Galili was surveying for shipwrecks off the Carmel coast in 1984 and found masonry instead. It lies in the northern bay of Atlit, a few hundred meters from the beach, under 8 to 12 meters of water. The village floor covers roughly 40,000 square meters. Houses, paved areas, hearths, and storage installations. Atlit-Yam is the name, the culture, final pre-pottery. Neolithic, the occupation, roughly 9,100 to 8,500 years ago. Its most eloquent feature is a hole. Well, 11 goes down 5.7 meters, measures 1.5 meters across, and is lined with some 28 courses of rough stone. Above a shaft driven a further 1.5 meters into bedrock to reach fresh groundwater. Its floor now lies 15.5 meters beneath sea level. Rock-cut wells in Cyprus are older, but nothing stone-lined anywhere is older than this. Read the fill from the bottom upward, and the ending is in it. The lowest layers are large stones almost free of refuse, which the excavators take as deliberate engineering. Lift the floor of the well, reach a higher and fresher part of the aquifer, stay ahead of the seawater arriving under the village. The material above those stones is different. Bones artifacts, plant remains, household rubbish. Once the well turned brackish, it became a place to throw things away. There are 46 graves holding about 63 people. 15 of them furnished flint axes with the men and grinding stones with the women. One holds a woman of about 25 with an infant of roughly a year, both showing bone lesions. And in 2008, a team under Israel Hershkovitz reported tuberculosis DNA from both, backed by the mycolic acid lipids specific to that organism. The strain is human, not bovine. 9,000 years ago, the disease was already ours inside a house that is now seabed. The food was good. A single 4 square meter unit produced over 6,000 fish bones. And 97% of the identified material was gray triggerfish with the gill arches gone, gutted, graded by size skin, left on, not a meal, but a store. And then the same coastline produced something nobody had expected to find. Tel Hreiz is a village of about 7,000 years ago, and in 2019, Galili's team published a line of boulders lying parallel to its old shore, around 3 meters under present sea level. More than 100 meters of it is exposed with a right-angled kink partway along. Every boulder is rounded and unworked half a meter to a meter in size, weighing from 200 kilograms up to a full ton. Stone like that occurs nowhere on that coast. It comes from river mouths, 1.6 kilometers north and 3.8 kilometers south, and each block was rolled, carried or dragged behind cattle, the only animals available. A harbor, a fish trap, a boundary wall, a stock pen, a defense against raiders. The excavators go through the alternatives and discard every one, and their conclusion is a sea defense. If that is correct, no older coastal defense exists anywhere on Earth. That village was occupied for 3 to 5 centuries, 10 generations at least, long enough for the loss to become undeniable, and long enough for somebody to conclude that hauling tons of rock several kilometers to a beach was a reasonable use of a community's labor. An extraordinary decision for a fishing village. It failed. Both the wall and the village are under the Mediterranean. 16 inundated Neolithic settlements are now identified over about 20 kilometers of the Carmel coast, and 23 along the country's full 195 kilometers. Each postdates the one before it, and each stands a little further inland, retreating ahead of the sea. Far Samir holds thousands of crushed olive stones, the oldest olive oil production known. Neolithic kept its burial ground away from its houses and holds 15 people, 8 of them children. After that, the coast falls silent for thousands of years. The truly disturbing thing about that map is its direction. A whole society is walking backwards at the pace of the water for 2 millennia. We can see any of it only because winter storms pull the sand off, and the moment it is gone, the sea starts dismantling the village. Sand extraction has accelerated the process. Each site is a contest between discovery and destruction, and we are losing it. Every place in this countdown had solved the same 5 problems: drinking water, food that would keep, shelter, a boundary worth holding, and somewhere to put the dead. Solve those 5, and you have a country, whatever anyone chooses to call it. And all 10 of them are now under the sea. The coastline printed on every map you have ever looked at is about 6,000 years old. It is simply the shoreline that stopped moving long enough for us to set our harbors and our cities against it. Tel Hreiz never got that. 10 generations there, watched their coast walking inland, understood precisely what it was doing, and answered with 100 meters of boulders hauled in from 3 kilometers away. The boulders are still down there, still in a line, holding nothing back. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.